Welcome to this conversation with Open-Ended Design. We speak with activists and creators from around the world about design, technology, and culture, unpacking their work, generating new ideas, and exploring their dreams for the future. Welcome to this open-ended conversation with Shezad Dawood. Shezad is a visual artist who works across the disciplines of painting, film, sculpture, performance, virtual reality, and other digital media. His work asks key questions of narrative, history, and embodiment. He uses the editing process as a method to explore both meaning and form, and his practice often involves collaboration and knowledge exchange. We know each other because our mums know each other. We both share the dubious distinction of being half Indian and half Pakistani. We are a rare breed. I'm a huge fan of his work, and I genuinely admire what he does in fusing artistic narratives with the issues of our time. Shezad is particularly passionate about climate change, and in this conversation we speak about the environment, technology, and his work across the South Asian subcontinent. Like myself, he feels both torn and equally committed to telling stories and leaning into the narratives of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and trying to go as deep as he possibly can. He's been able to build a career which weaves across the regions from which we both originate into actual output that's meaningful, that's resonant, and that's challenging all of us to think about our futures in new and different ways. I'm super proud to call him my friend, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So welcome Shezad Dawood to this conversation with Open-Ended. We're really excited to have Shezad on the platform. He is a multidisciplinary artist, but I would describe him as so much more, and he'll talk a little bit about his practice and his work right now. Maybe we could start by you telling us a little bit about your life growing up in London, and also how and why you chose to study art.
Well, hi, Suhair, and thank you for having me on Open-Ended. It's nice to be here, and it's always nice to catch up for a chat because I find our conversations, I never quite know where they're going to lead, and that's always, that's always a good thing. Well, I was born in Hammersmith in the 70s, and but I did actually go back and live with my grandmother in Karachi in 1980. So that was quite an interesting formative moment. I'd go back to visit family and friends in South Asia regularly, but I did go back when I was 6 years old to live in Karachi for a couple of years, which was really, I think it just sort of broke me out of a purely London-centric kind of mindset. And also it just, I think 6 to 8 is quite formative. So it did sort of totally shift some of my ideas around light, color, culture, and made me, I think there's something really useful when you're not just totally incubated within one language or cultural system.
And to be with somebody from a different generation also. So do you have any memories from that time?
Oh yeah, really rich memories. I think also because it was a very different time for Karachi than the current moment. It was a much more um, open. I actually, as a 6 year old, you're not sort of hyper aware of the politics, but you sense the change in the air. So I was there before and then after the coup by Zia al-Haq, and you could see the shift in the society, but you couldn't know where it would lead to. It's so. Yeah, it was a very open kind of society. It was actually very safe. We used to play cricket in the streets and go and kind of run around the docks at Kimari. And, it was a really idyllic kind of moment. I don't think anybody
That's
knew how short-lived it would be.
But also you're lucky because you saw a time in Karachi that few people now, I think, can recognize.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was, there was still, the odd bar and club, and there were sort of disco dancing parties for kids, where you'd have disco competitions, and you just wouldn't imagine that now.
Mm. Okay, so then you came back to London and then you finished school.
Yeah.
And then
And then art school, it was always art school for me, I think, somewhat to my parents' dismay and, disappointment. I ended up going to do foundation at St. Martin's, which was my dream and then carried on to do my undergrad at St Martin's, and then my master's at the Royal College. So it was it was all pretty amazing, and it was really like I sort of found the people I wanted to be in dialogue with. Both at CSM and at the Royal College, I was often collaborating across departments. I remember my master's was actually in photography at the Royal College, but I was often skipping across the alley to kind of collaborate with people in fashion or graphic design. And, I never really was too kind of bought into some of those sort of hierarchies of high versus low, or one medium over another. I finished school in the 90s, and that sort of 90s moment, sort of early 90s in London, there wasn't the art psychology was nowhere near as big as it is now. So, you'd be at a bar or a party, and you'd chat to someone, and the next week you'd be collaborating on something, whether they were a DJ, an improv musician, a fashion designer. Nobody had any money. There wasn't that much money in the system. So actually it was a very creative moment where people weren't too territorial, and people were very open to experimentation.
That's really interesting. I mean, I do find that London still has some of that space for the creative community actually finding itself as one, which you don't see at all in places like New York, for example, where it's so completely siloed, and I guess probably because it's bigger. But I wonder how much is driven by these schools, because CSM is a great example. Fashion is such a strong program there, but so is theater, and art and architecture, and you kind of have that natural crossover probably because of it. And then students like yourself.
Well, I suppose CSM is really quite well known for producing mavericks. And I suppose it's interesting you said about theatre design, because actually from foundation, it was a very close call for me between going into theatre design or fine art. But that idea of kind of seeing an exhibition or a wider practice as a larger kind of, theatrical or operatic production was something that always excited me. That how do you go beyond the bounds of the white cube, or a more static, I mean, I paint, so I'm and I love painting, so it's not against a particular medium, but how does painting sort of start to speak? What are how do you alter the conditions within which you even present a painting, let alone other objects or media? There is a degree where experience comes into play, but obviously both myself and as a studio, we're always taking risks. So that restlessness and that need to keep asking questions, both of the content and the form, is a key driver. So it's also being mindful of how to work with others. And I think that for me is always how to make great work. It's to kind of invite other voices. So it's not just yours in isolation. That's a great way to sense check yourself. Is not just to be in the echo chamber of your own voice, and then to be surrounded by really great collaborators. So as well as the sort of internal studio team, we're often working with a wonderful range of composers, improv musicians, coders, developers, designers. It's pretty it's pretty great if constantly kind of challenging. So because it's almost like, I think, sometimes the team laugh at my kind of constant need to kind of, to experiment each time. So each project is almost a learning curve that kind of exhausts us, but pushes us into something new. I like getting my hands dirty. I like having my hand in things. We were recently doing this crazy, it's this commission for Homerton College at Cambridge University, where I was working with translating landscape into pixel and then back into a hand process. So I'm very obsessed with where the hand and technology meet in unexpected kind of pairings. So I actually designed a whole pixelated landscape that was then hand sculpted as ceramic tiles. So it's a landscape with pixelation that's hand sculpted. It's like an oxymoron of a project. But then it's a 7-meter wide sort of CinemaScope wall of ceramic, and we'd never done anything that big or that challenging. And we worked with a factory up in Blackburn on the ceramics at that scale, because they've got sort of giant kilns that can manage it. But I went up with Miranda, my partner and studio director, thinking we had a couple of days work to do, and realizing it was like a week's work to paint, because we hand painted all these ceramic tiles so they were all hand glazed. And I was just it was very important to me to be there doing that. Also because we were trying all sorts of experimental glazes and this, and so, even ceramics is technology.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the other thing is like we sort of have lost that idea. Like, I'm really curious on your thoughts on technology. Maybe we can talk about it now because, so I was going to say, the first thing I was going to say was around this idea of the artist not becoming the CEO and to stay connected to your craft. And it's kind of amazing that the example you chose to talk about was this idea of you're actually glazing something physically. And yesterday I was at the opening for Anish Kapoor's new exhibition, and saw painting. And he spent the last year and a half like furiously painting, like just, in isolation with his family. And it was so amazing to see this like artist, like, who we know for these like massive like sculptures and installations, and it's all like, him connecting back to the canvas. And so I just find that really evocative, this idea of you feeling this need to connect, especially as you become more well known and you get, bigger and there's more demand for your time, how you stay creative, and that should be a part of it. And I mean, it's worrying with young people now that they don't actually have the chance to do that as much also.
Yeah, I think it's always a tough one, isn't it? As an artist, how do you keep your hand in but still grow the ambition and the potential of what you do? I can't say I have a good or a perfect answer for you though, Suhair. I don't sleep enough, and I'm generally quite exhausted.
Can you explain for people who don't know about Kalimpong what it is and why you did that piece?
So Kalimpong is a small town in the Indian Himalayas near the borders with Tibet and Nepal. And I've been fascinated by Kalimpong as a site since I was a teenager. As a teenage boy, one of my favorite things to read was Alexandra David Neal's writing. For those who don't know, she was a Franco-Belgian woman explorer, was the first Western woman to enter Tibet in about 200 years, because at that point it was closed off to sort of foreigners. It was a very sort of secretive, closed center for esoteric Buddhism. And she actually crossed over dressed as a Tibetan beggar. And as a kid, those sort of stories, just fueled my imagination. And then, interestingly, in my 30s, I was reading about Tom Slick, a Texan oil millionaire, who funded various expeditions to look for the Yeti in the mountain ranges above Kalimpong. But, it was connected to the CIA and various things. So, there was a lot of... Kalimpong, it just seemed for what is now a very small, sleepy town, but, from the 19th into the 20th century, roughly till about the 70s, was a hotbed of esoterica, espionage, intrigue, with the Chinese sort of invasion of Tibet going on next door. The CIA were fueling sort of Tibetan guerrillas. And at one point, even Nehru in sort of post-independence India sort of, declared Kalimpong a nest of spies. So,
Really?
And for me, a project starts to take on shape or form when there's three converging ideas or three converging points of interest. So somehow between Alexandra David Neal, Tom Slick and Nehru and Tibet, there was... it was like, oh my God, there's so much going on in this space.
Tiny place.
And also it became the first project I did with VR. So I'd been kind of experimenting with VR in the studio for a few years, mainly thanks to, thanks? I don't know. I was being actively encouraged to kind of look at the medium, and, I was actually a bit sort of wary of it, having been disappointed by it not living up to its promises in the 90s. So I was lucky enough to get a Vive headset a few years before they went public. So I'd been experimenting, thinking, do I want to work with this medium? Is this fit for artistic production or not? And then Kalimpong was born, which seemed actually to answer a lot of the questions I wanted to ask of VR, which were more philosophical than functional. I was interested in this idea of embodiment, disembodiment, and what better way to ask some of those questions than to make the theater of operations this, the geographical kind of home of esoteric Buddhism.
How hard is it to take a medium that you're not comfortable with and to ask something like so vast and to like connect with that? Because you have to park aside a little bit of your own expectations of what your audience expects of you, I assume.
I've seen a lot of things recently where, oh, big name artist does VR, but does that artist have any investment in that space? And, I think in my case, I'd been working with experimental film and ideas of immersive audio content for years. So it was a sort of, it was a very natural segue. But even then, I took 3 years over it. I didn't rush something out in a couple of months and to a sort of more commercial depth timetable.
I mean, this is like a general, like, coming from this tech space, is this kind of balance between how artists engage with technologies, and why they do it. And I think it is really, I mean, then the outcome is in your work. And that has been really powerful to see that evolve over time. And so you've done a lot with VR, and I know you're really interested and engaged in issues of climate change, but you did a beautiful piece, I think, a few years ago now at Venice. And now I know you're also working on something right now. I don't know if it's already opened, a VR piece, which I don't know if you can talk about.
Yeah, so there is a more recent VR work called the Terrarium. And, that was quite an amazing project. So yes, I've been working, doing a lot of work with the intersection between oceans, migration, and mental health since I launched Leviathan in Venice in 2017. For people who want more on that vast, sprawling project, please just go to leviathan-cycle.com and you'll get there's a whole lot of material there, including copyleft papers and talks with a number of environmentalists and activists that are all, free to air.
It's a beautiful, beautiful project. And to see it in that space in Venice was all the more moving, given, that you're sort of at the edge of the water. So really one of my favorite pieces ever at Venice. But anyway, go on.
Well, as part of, Leviathan since Venice, we've had a number of talks. Because I'm constantly meeting amazing minds and specialists in various disciplines, from, marine engineers to oceanographers to paleoclimatologists to geneticists to virologists. It's sort of trying to sort of bring their ideas to the foreground rather than just sort of, hidden in academia. But one of the most amazing talks was by a paleoclimatologist, Dr. Martin Ziegler from Utrecht University. He spoke at a symposium we did in Amsterdam in 2018. And, paleoclimatologists are studying climate over millions, even billions of years. But he brought it right, he brought it right bang up to date. And his last slide was Europe if all the ice would melt. So just to kind of bring millions of years of climate modeling right up to kind of what we face. And I remember, I drew in a gasp of breath, and I heard pretty much, most of the audience do as well. And basically he showed us a map where there was one extended body of water from an eroded, Kent coastline to the Baltics, and Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands were all underwater. And I remember just that image, burnt itself, into my mind. And I was just like, I couldn't, when something really hits you and it's very affecting, you can't quite shake it. And then, amazingly, I think in 2019, I was approached crazily by a Kai Art Center in Tallinn in Estonia, and, by Up Projects and the Folkestone Triennial. Separately, they totally separately asked me if I'd be interested in doing a new project with them, combining oceans and technology. They'd both been very interested in what I'd done with Leviathan, and they were both very interested in my work with VR. And I just thought, this is uncanny that literally what had impacted me most in the map was Kent and the Baltics, and I had two institutions, the two institutions reflecting those territories kind of approaching me. And so I said, can we make it a co-production and a collaboration? And one of the and so I started to kind of imagine the sort of timescale. So we loosely plucked 300 years into the future, out of the ether as a kind of timescale for the sort of what we wanted the VR to reflect. And what's become almost crazily typical in my life is the amazing conversations I'm having with people. And it turned out in 2019 at CPH Docs, the film festival in Copenhagen, I was asked to interview Professor Esker Willerslev, one of the world's leading evolutionary geneticists. And I think again we freaked out the audience because I was asking him about hybrid species. I've always been a huge Donna Haraway fan, and I was very interested in taking the post-human from a theoretical or a critical idea into, is this, from the scientific, pragmatic point of view, what's possible? And I've always been quite fascinated by octopi and their color change abilities. So I said to Esker on stage, I was like, is that possible in my lifetime, that you can kind of splice my DNA and give me color change ability? And he said, theoretically, yes. He said, actually, and he what really sort of, I think, disturbed a lot of the audience was he just likened it to, he said it was less about the science than about the social. And it's the social acceptability of these things. You'd obviously just recently had at that point the sort of Chinese designer baby scandal. And he said, that demonstrates it's all possible through CRISPR and other technologies. But the big challenge you have is the social acceptability. And he likened it to the curve with plastic surgery. So, if plastic surgery was developed pretty, as largely as a response to First World War battlefield injuries, how it went from a very specific niche application to the fact that now you can have unlicensed practitioners, injecting you with filler on your street corner. That's quite an interesting arc in about 100 years.
Why don't they talk about this stuff? Is it because it's too much, or it's because it's not possible? I mean, I was thinking about technology and kind of how, like, when, things like the self-driving car, the idea was always like the car should just drive by itself because human error is the reason that people have car accidents. But obviously, no human is okay with that logic, and so now cars like accelerate better or like slow down faster, but they don't actually make you feel like you've completely lost control, but actually you're kind of paying halfway attention is even more dangerous than you're fully driving. But like that hasn't yet happened. And same, I think, with this stuff is like, why don't we just make a hybrid human and just see what happens? Or are we doing that slowly enough? And you and I probably can think of a few people who look like sort of halfway there. And I don't know, I'm curious about those conversations and why someone like him should have to have been asked a question by you. Maybe he has just never been asked.
I think, those questions are out there, but, it's funny how, a progressive, critical audience all love Donna Haraway, but the idea of some of that stuff actually coming into play in real social daily life is actually, terrifying and ethically problematic. And I just think, how do we have those? How do we take the fear out of so much of our, and the scaremongering out of so many of our conversations? I was just reading last night that the British Medical Association has shifted its position on assisted dying from opposition to neutrality. And that's taken about 20 years, and, there's this whole thing where, how it takes time. I think it just takes time, as Esker was saying, for social attitudes to change and to kind of meet technology. And it's not always a bad thing, because it gives, I think time allows for conversations and ethical debates to take place and for things to become socially acceptable. So I think there's a balance, isn't there, where, the social factor acts as a check, but it is sometimes holding things, back, but but who knows? I mean,
right. And then you have accelerations in times of crisis, for example, right now, or entire populations on whom experiments are done. in other ways. Anyhow, so to come back to your project right now, so you had this conversation on the stage, and then
And so I started to build this world of 300 years into the future, based on the sea level rise. So I love dovetailing science fact with speculative fiction. I mean, there, I love that sort of cusp where the two meet and kind of can produce strange offspring. Um, I think it's such a kind of a charged space for kind of creativity and as you say, for to just generate debate and conversations around what comes next. So I started, and then I went further and I thought, well, you've got sea level rise, but you've got temperature and salinity change, as we all know, is already taking place, actually faster than most models have predicted. And so I started to sort of draw on marine biologists to kind of think about if you have this, new greater Baltic Sea, what species would inhabit it? And so then the next, and I love workshopping these things with marine biologists.
and how do they feel about workshopping with you? How does that work? Are they like open to it or busy with doing their marine biology? I'm curious about that.
Well, of course, everyone, in their field is generally very dedicated and very immersed, but I'm immensely grateful to a kind of long stream of collaborators taking some time out to give me a bit of their input, and then they enjoy it. And actually, sometimes it's been a while since Leviathan launched in Venice. It was 2017, and now actually sometimes I get scientists getting in touch with the studio wanting to collaborate with me. I think because sometimes it does demonstrate, that I can just sort of make their ideas more public, attract different audiences, etc.
But I mean, I just think it's super interesting because those conversations are probably very, like, surprisingly to probably yourself, like, because it's easy for you. Those are difficult conversations because you're speaking actually different languages. And I think it's so beautiful how you say that you're able to get their ideas or their work out. And I think we often don't realize that is that you have people. There was a book a few years ago on climate change called The Uninhabitable Earth, and it was written by a journalist who said that he kept meeting scientists at scientific conferences who were talking about like the earth heating up and us no longer being able to live on it. And he was like, where is this information? They must be lying because it's not in the news. And then he realized, well, it's because they were doing all this work and they were not, their research, was all just so academic and so abstract, or just impermeable in how it was written, and also so frightening. And so I love this idea of how you've been able to connect not only with them and their ideas, but to thoughtfully engage so that you can tell stories around their work, but to do so in a way that's obviously consumable by, the general public, but also makes them feel like they have a different kind of voice. And that's, I think, a great power of your work and your practice in general. And I think you're very humble about it. But that's why I'm really excited for this. And where is this? How far is it from London? Not
Folkestone,
that far.
it's an hour or so on the train, and it's nice. It's by the
Okay,
seaside,
good.
so you can get a good fish and chips on the boardwalk, and there's a lot of other great installations, on the waterfront, so and around the town. It's a really wonderfully quirky and fascinating triennial at Folkestone, and often they have some of the commissions from previous triennials continue, are permanent, so it's almost this sort of growing archive of projects and interventions.
Oh, that's really cool. Okay, I'm gonna go. Okay, so I have this in like my research on you is that you imagine the Earth with 90% water, and then you have like a whole audio and stuff. So can you describe it a little bit? And also, is it going to be traveling?
Okay, so I mean, it's quite a crazy experience. I'm just not sure how much to say without spoiler alert. But
Say a little bit.
well, one of the key things going back to the idea of embodiment, I was very interested in kind of what our discomfort with a post-human kind of genetic future. So actually, you start in a waiting room where you just get used to your new body, and your new body is a post-human cephalopod hybrid. So that in itself is a very, it's something I wanted to give people a moment to kind of, oh, what if my body was other? And, as somebody from an immigrant family, this idea of othering has always been very key to my thinking and my writing. And I think for me that I'm very at this moment interested in empathy even beyond the human. So within, of course, within and across different ethnicities, languages, gender formations, but also what is, one of the things I think becomes a bit of a blind spot for us as a species is other species and the planet itself, and starting to kind of understand a kind of a cohabitation.
I mean, there's also, I just read this book on octopus, on the octopi. I'm sure you read it. I'll just remember the name. But about how we choose to anthropomorphize animals in order to feel like we can connect with them. And like, despite probably knowing better, that's the only way to communicate and to connect. And in some ways, it's useful because it allows us that empathy. But in other ways, exactly to your point, why can't we just see them as what they are and still find a space within us to connect with them as completely other?
Yeah, I think as well it's not completely other, but perhaps, we've spent so long civilizing the animal out of ourselves, that there's a lot of unresolved tension there. And I do wonder, even from a kind of, psychoanalytic point of view, how much work we have yet to do to kind of resolve some of the tensions, the violences, that exist within us.
Speaking of that, the animal within us and the violences within us, I think there's two things. Is one is I've personally found the last few weeks and the news and Pakistan, South Asia, Afghanistan to be quite triggering because we've just lived through the war on terror, and now the stories that we were told are being exposed as in many ways to be questioned, but also the stories of violence, I think, more than the violence itself, become the thing that reminds us of how how inhuman, I guess, as we want to describe it, we can be to one another. But anyway, to bring that to your most recent project before this, the concert for Bangladesh, that for me was also very, very resonant. And I, so admire you and your work on this. And I know it's been a long time coming and a passion of work really of the heart and a passion project for you and Diana. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And I know that now we can actually all experience it. And so we'll share a link for you, but even for you to talk about the experience, the composers, the music, how you worked with it would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a sort of, I think, often I don't realize what an epic project I'm embarking on, and it's a good thing because otherwise I'd never do it, whether it was Leviathan or Concert from Bangladesh. But when Diana called saying, would you be interested to revisit the legacy of the 71 Concert for Bangladesh? I was like, sure. I mean, partly because I really trust Diana and, we've worked together, on many occasions before, but there's such a great sort of, dovetailing of our approaches ethically and kind of, artistically. But then I sort of realized, some way into it, it's like, what the hell am I doing as somebody of Pakistani descent, attempting to tell the story of Bangladesh, where if anything, the Pakistanis only had a malign role to play. And then I realized, talking about triggering around Afghanistan, I realized, okay, there's a sort of degree of ancestral guilt, and that's maybe my role in this, is to step out of it and just bring my experience, my skill set to bear. And as somebody who's worked with a number of musicians, composers, improvisers in all of my films and digital works, but it caused me to pause and reflect and realize that I'm always inviting people to collaborate on my project. So somehow with this one, I was like, how do I step into the background a bit? And so I said to Diana, we really need to find a whole team in Bangladesh, who. So we started consulting with music producers, music programmers, and we worked with them to establish who would the lineup be for our concert from Bangladesh, and how would we, in a 45-minute concert, just show something. You weren't going to cover everything, but you could show something of the richness of musical traditions from Bangladesh, from the past into the present. And we had a real dream team, and it became this sort of fascinating project operating over multiple time zones as well, because we also worked with people in Bangladeshi diaspora in the UK and in Brooklyn, and as well as people on the ground in Dhaka and outside. So the whole concert even begins with RF Baal, from the Baal tradition, which is like the mystical tradition of both Bangladesh and India. And RF is not on modern technology, so we sent Shomo, a music programmer and producer in Bangladesh, who has a good relationship with him, to go find him. So Shomo had to go to rural Kushtia to kind of have that conversation that, hello, would you like to come and be part of this mixed reality concert? And so there was a lot of, and also under a time of COVID, to produce all this thing, working in multiple sites, time zones, it was crazy. And we were dealing with multiple lockdowns. It was amazing we pulled it off. So the concert was live streamed on August the 1st, the 50th anniversary of the original concert, and features an amazing range from RF Ball and from rural Kushtia through to a middle section with classical vocalists collaborating with electronic music producers. So we were doing some pretty crazy things. I mean, the whole middle section, I just think, is epic of the concert, because it literally moves from Nazrul Sangeet to classical raga styles to sort of drum and bass and dubstep, and just to show what's happening in Bangladesh today, and it's breathtaking. And then we obviously finish with Gully Boy Rana and Tabib, who are have a huge grassroots following in Bangladesh. They're a hip hop duo. Gully Boy Rana is a 12-year-old boy from the slums who was found selling roses on the street and turned out to be the most amazing they're both the most amazing socially engaged performers. So, they actually called out the government on misusing funds that were meant for education, and then the money was actually repurposed because they've got such a following. So, it really kind of fits with a lot of the sort of longer term ethics of the studio. Also, the whole concert, we're not anticipating raising millions like the original did, where nobody's got the profile of George Harrison. But at the same time, we work collaboratively with Friendship, an NGO in Bangladesh that works with some of the poorest rural communities literally on the front line of climate change. These are people who are internal refugees year on year, just because they live in floodplains, the Chars in Bangladesh. And Friendship work.
And Bangladesh is one of the countries in the world most exposed to rising seawater levels and climate change, right?
Absolutely. I mean, literally practically half the country is a floodplain. But actually, we also didn't want to go, we didn't want to disempower Bangladesh and a vision of it. So actually, in time I've spent in Bangladesh and meeting architects and practitioners and other people there, they're a really resilient people. And, they've been working for years on adaptive amphibious designs for architecture, building, that actually are worthy of export. Now that the rest of the world is going to face some of those issues, just slightly later in the curve than Bangladesh, there's a lot we can learn from Bangladesh.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And so are you gonna go after COVID so people can listen to your concert there and you can show them your work?
Yes, I mean, there's been a series of lockdowns, but basically the concert after its initial live stream has been going on tour. So it's now been shown at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, at Victoria Park in London as part of All Points East. It was last Sunday, part of Second Sundays at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn. We have a screening coming up this Saturday, the 18th of September at Rich Mix in Bethnal Green.
Super cool. And I wonder if you're going to do anything on Brick Lane with all the community around there.
Well, I mean, Rich Mix is it's at the top of Brick
far.
Lane. It's right by Brick Lane. So, and we have an amazing set of speakers after the concert will be shown. So we have Mumtaz Begum Hussain, a sort of broadcaster, writer, artist. She'll be moderating a conversation between Probat Rahman, one of the co-composers of Section 2, who's been almost, not single-handedly, but as part of the Daytimers Collective, relaunching a kind of Asian underground Mark II in the UK. But also beaming in from Dhaka will be Ruxmini Chowdhury from the Samdani Art Foundation, who was the research and archive curator on the project, because it involves a lot of archive material. It's really quite an amazing mixed reality journey. So, we shot all the musicians on green screen, and then literally using Unity, Unreal, technologies, built a whole virtual stage set, drawing on through dialogues with the artists, asking them, which locations in Bangladesh had particular meaning for them and their work. So, you go on a virtual journey from 8th century Buddhist Paharpur to beauty boarding, in the streets of Dhaka. And beauty boarding is a sort of literary cafe where political activists meet. So there's a real rich journey there. And we also worked, with Friendship, the NGO, on their archive of their work. So some of that footage is combined into it, and all proceeds. So you can go on to, if you put in on your Google search, Pioneer Works Concert from Bangladesh, you find a whole page where you can download do a digital download of the concert album. There's merch that I've designed with Fraser Muggeridge Studio, produced with ethical factories in Bangladesh, and some scarves actually that are made by women in the chars who are supported by Friendship. And all the proceeds will be split between Friendship and the musicians themselves, who've obviously been quite hard hit by COVID and their inability to perform live.
Amazing. Well, I was listening to it yesterday, and it's really, really cool. Okay, so we have to wrap up now, not least because you're very busy. But we actually end all of our conversations with our guests by asking them a question about what their call to action would be for our listeners. And there's so much that you're doing, and you have engaged in so many different, not just, I guess, practices, but also issues. And I wonder if there's any one thing that you would say, particularly to young people listening in the space around, what would be your call to action right now?
I think it's climate. There is, but there's so many kind of nuances to that. So, as well as the work with Friendship on Concert from Bangladesh, I also have opening in London this week a group show I've curated called Havala, which features a sort of intergenerational group of artists of South Asian origin. And it's with Paradise Row Projects, which is a relaunch of the original Paradise Row Gallery that was around in the noughties into the tens. But they've relaunched as a community interest company, as a 1-year project with, I think they're going to have 5 or 6 curated shows. And they very kindly, as one of the original artists of the gallery, invited me to curate the opening show. But every show they do, all the proceeds are given to a charity or charities of the curator's choice. So having worked extensively with Bangladesh for a concert from Bangladesh for Havala, all the proceeds will be going to Conservation Action Trust in India and to WWF in Pakistan, with a specific focus on mangrove ecosystems. So, I think, okay, climate environment for people out there, it's within that, climate environment takes in a huge field. What is it? Find your thing within that. Find, something you can focus on. So, with Havala, we're particularly devoting all funds raised to mangrove ecosystems. That's, at the moment, I'm having so many conversations, I have to kind of rein it down to what are my two, what are the two causes I'm really passionate about at the moment? One is mangrove ecosystems, mangroves in terms of sea level rise mitigation, in terms of filtration systems between saltwater and freshwater systems. Read up on mangroves. They are vital to our future survival. And they're in so many spaces, from the Philippines to Senegal to all across South Asia. These are very, very key ecosystems. And so read up on mangroves. The other one, just going back to oceans and ocean futures, is the twilight zone of the ocean. The twilight zone of the ocean represents some of the greatest carbon capture and migration on Earth, and it's entirely non-human. So I don't know, we're running out of time, but the lowest level of the ocean is the midnight zone. Just above that is the twilight zone, which contains a huge volume of biomass, i.e. living creatures, that come up every night to the surface. actually take carbon in and take it back down to the seafloor. And then their carbon capture function is also further increased through their excretions, their dying, and actually at the moment there are talks about parceling up fishing rights to the twilight zone, which would be absolutely devastating because the twilight zone of the ocean is a greater carbon reservoir than the whole Amazon rainforest. I'm also doing some work on the Amazon, so please, the Amazon we need to save too, but look into the twilight zone and mangroves. Those are my two thoughts for the week.
Oh, that's really powerful. Wow.
Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for your help. I mean, Suhair, just for people to know, you put us in touch with Conservation Action Trust and helped open a conversation there about mangrove protection and conservation. So, you're doing your bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Shezad.
Thank you for listening. We welcome you to join and continue the conversation over on our Instagram at openended.design. You can also find us on LinkedIn at Open-Ended Design and our website at www.openended.design.